Hi, I'm James Young, and today I want to share with you the story of how I learned English in just 6 months. It's hard to believe it's been such a short time, and looking back, I can see how much I've grown. I remember when I first decided to learn English. It wasn't something that happened overnight. It took time, patience, and a lot of effort. But I am so glad I made that decision. 6 months ago, I was in a place where I didn't know much English at all. I could say simple words like hello or thank you, but that was about it. I felt stuck. There were so many opportunities I wanted to take, but I realized that if I didn't learn English, I might miss out on them. I couldn't talk to people from different countries or travel to new places easily. I couldn't understand movies or songs in English. And most importantly, I couldn't fully connect with the world outside of my own. One day I sat down and thought about my future. I asked myself, what could I achieve if I knew English? Suddenly, it felt like there were endless possibilities. I could make friends from all over the world, get better jobs, study in other countries, and even watch my favorite shows in English without needing subtitles. I knew it would be hard, but I was determined to try. The idea of speaking in English, communicating freely, and feeling more confident in conversations excited me. I also realized that learning English wasn't just about knowing words or grammar. It was about opening doors to a new world. It felt like a big challenge, and I was nervous at first. I wasn't sure if I could do it, but I promised myself that I would not give up. I told myself, I'm going to try my best. I don't have to be perfect, but I'll be better than I was yesterday. So, I began. I didn't know exactly where to start, but I took the first step. I didn't rush or think that it would happen instantly. Instead, I focused on the process. I understood that learning English, like anything else in life, requires time and practice. There were days when I felt frustrated, and there were times when I doubted myself, but I kept going. And little by little, I started to see the results. In these 6 months, I have learned a lot about English, but I've also learned a lot about myself. I've learned that with dedication and the right mindset, even the biggest challenges can become manageable. This journey hasn't just been about learning a language. It's been about growing, stepping out of my comfort zone, and believing that I could improve. Now, I want to share this story with you because I know that if I can do it, so can you. The road to learning English may not always be easy, but every step forward is worth it. And I'm here to tell you, with patience and practice, you too can achieve your goals. Learning English wasn't fast, and at times it felt like I wasn't making any progress at all. In the beginning, I found it overwhelming. There were so many new words, rules, and sounds that I didn't know. Every time I tried to speak, I felt like I was getting lost in my own thoughts. And when I listened to native speakers, I couldn't understand everything they said. It was frustrating, and at times, I wanted to give up. But here's what I learned early on. Learning a new language is a marathon, not a sprint. If you're expecting to learn English overnight, you might feel disappointed. It's not something that happens in a few days or even a few weeks. But that doesn't mean you can't make progress. In fact, I learned that small, consistent steps every day add up to big changes over time. The key is to not rush the process. You don't have to be perfect right away. What matters is that you keep going, even when it feels like you're not moving fast enough. There were days when I felt like I wasn't improving at all. I would study new vocabulary or try to learn a grammar rule. But then, when I tried to use it in a sentence, I would forget the words or mix up the tenses. I wanted to speak perfectly, but I had to remind myself that mistakes are a part of learning. It's normal to make mistakes, and that's how we grow. I realized that perfection wasn't the goal. Improvement was. Another important lesson I learned was that everyone's journey is different. Some people learn faster, and some people take a little more time. That's okay. It's important to not compare yourself to others. I kept reminding myself that my goal was to improve, not to be better than someone else. If I could speak one more sentence than I could the day before, that was a win. If I understood a conversation better than I did last week, that was progress. I also learned that it's not just about learning vocabulary or grammar. It's about putting those words and rules into practice. At first, I felt nervous about speaking, but I pushed myself to practice every day, even if it was just saying a few sentences aloud. Slowly, I began to feel more confident. The key was consistency. Even on days when I didn't feel like studying, I forced myself to practice for just 10 or 15 minutes. Those small moments of practice made a huge difference over time. It's also important to set realistic goals for yourself. In the beginning, I didn't try to learn everything at once. I set small, achievable goals, like learning 5 new words every day or listening to an English podcast for 10 minutes. Little by little, these goals added up. After a few weeks, I looked back and saw how much I had accomplished. Setting small goals made the process feel less overwhelming and kept me motivated. But there were times when I felt discouraged. There were days when I was tired, or when I didn't feel like learning. On those days, it was easy to feel like I wasn't making any progress, but I had to remind myself that this was part of the process. Learning anything new takes time. It's okay to feel frustrated sometimes. What matters is that you keep going. And even on the days when I didn't feel like studying, I reminded myself that I was still moving forward, one step at a time. Looking back, I now see that the most important thing I did was to stay patient with myself. Learning English, or any language, isn't about rushing to the finish line. It's about enjoying the journey and celebrating the small victories along the way. Yes, it takes time, and yes, it can be tough at times. But with the right steps and with the right mindset, I promise you that you can improve. So if you're feeling frustrated or worried that you're not learning fast enough, remember this: the process is just as important as the outcome. You are learning every day, even if it doesn't feel like it. Every word you learn, every sentence you speak, is progress. And that progress will build up over time, just like it did for me. Stay patient, stay consistent, and trust the process. You will get better step by step. When I first started learning English, I knew that the most important thing was to begin with the basics. I couldn't expect to speak fluently right away, and I didn't want to overwhelm myself with too much information. So, I decided to focus on the simple, everyday words and phrases that I would use in real-life situations. After all, learning English is all about being able to communicate with others, and I knew that learning a few essential words would be the perfect starting point. I began with words like hello, goodbye, thank you, and please. These are words that everyone uses in daily conversation, and I knew they would be useful right away. At first, I practiced saying them out loud over and over again, until they felt natural. I wanted to be able to greet people and thank them properly, even if I didn't know much else in English. It may sound simple, but it was so rewarding to be able to say these words correctly. They gave me the confidence to continue learning, knowing that I could at least make a good first impression. Next, I learned how to introduce myself. I practiced saying, "My name is James Young." It was such an exciting moment the first time I said it clearly in English. I felt proud, even though it was just a simple sentence. I knew it was an important first step, because introducing myself is something I would have to do every time I met someone new. So I practiced this introduction every day until it felt like second nature. I also learned how to ask basic questions like, "What's your name?" and "Where are you from?" These small phrases opened the door to so many conversations. Every time I used them, it felt like I was becoming more connected to the language and to the world around me. One of the first things I realized was that learning these words wasn't just about memorizing them. It was about practicing them in different situations. For example, I would greet my friends in English, even though they didn't speak it fluently. I'd say, "Hello," with a big smile, and sometimes they would reply, "How are you?" I would try to answer in English even if I only knew a few words. "I'm fine, thank you," or "I'm good, and you?" These small conversations helped me feel comfortable with the words and gave me real-life experience using them. As I practiced these basic phrases, I started learning more vocabulary that was essential for daily life. I learned words related to family, like mother, father, brother, and sister. I learned the names of common objects in my house, like chair, table, book, and window. At first, I felt like I was learning a huge list of words, but I didn't rush myself. I took it one word at a time. I'd see something in my house, like a pen, and say the word out loud several times. I also used sticky notes to label things around my home. I put the word pen on my pen, book on my books, and so on. This made it easier to remember the words when I saw them in real life. After a few weeks, I started learning how to ask basic questions in English like, "How are you?" and "What time is it?" These simple questions were very useful in everyday situations, and I felt more comfortable starting conversations with others. Asking questions allowed me to learn more about the world around me and helped me practice forming sentences. I also started learning numbers because they are so important in many situations, like when you're talking about time, money, or dates. Learning numbers felt like a big step because it helped me feel more confident in different contexts. At first, everything seemed like a challenge. Sometimes I would forget the words I just learned, and other times I would struggle to pronounce them correctly. But the more I practiced, the more natural it became. I realized that learning vocabulary wasn't just about repeating words. It was about creating connections between the words and real-life experiences. For example, when I learned the word book, I connected it to reading a story, and when I learned the word apple, I thought about the time I ate an apple for breakfast. By connecting words to real things, I was able to remember them better. Eventually, I expanded my vocabulary to include basic verbs like eat, go, run, walk, and drink. These words are the building blocks of many sentences. I could now form simple sentences like, "I eat breakfast," or "She goes to school." I was amazed at how quickly I could start making my own sentences, even with just a few words. It felt empowering to create something with the vocabulary I had learned. I also learned common phrases for greetings and small talk. For example, "How are you?" and "I'm fine, thank you." Even though I wasn't fluent yet, being able to have these basic conversations made me feel more confident. I would practice asking "How are you?" to my family members, and they would respond with simple answers like "I'm good" or "I'm tired." This was a great way to practice because it allowed me to hear English in context and understand how the words fit together in sentences. During this stage of learning, I didn't focus too much on grammar. My goal was to learn the words I needed to communicate in everyday situations. I didn't worry about making mistakes, and I didn't expect to speak perfectly right away. The goal was to start using English as much as possible and get used to the flow of the language. I focused on learning simple vocabulary that would help me get by in real conversations, and over time, I started to feel more comfortable. Learning these simple words and phrases wasn't just the beginning of my language journey. It was the foundation. Without them, I wouldn't have been able to progress to the more complex sentences and conversations later on. By starting small, I built my confidence and motivation to keep going. And even though the progress seemed slow at first, every new word and phrase added up, and before I knew it, I could have basic conversations in English. In the end, starting with these simple words and phrases was the most important step. It gave me the foundation I needed to continue learning, and it showed me that learning a new language is about building, one word at a time. If you're just beginning your English journey, remember, it's okay to start small. Every word you learn brings you one step closer to speaking confidently and fluently. One of the most important steps in my journey to learning English was listening to it every day. I quickly realized that no matter how many words I learned or how much grammar I studied, I wouldn't be able to understand real English conversations unless I practiced listening to the language in different contexts. At first, I found it a bit difficult because the speed at which native speakers talk can be overwhelming, and sometimes I couldn't catch every word. But over time, I learned that listening consistently was the key to improving my understanding and my ability to speak. I started by listening to English songs. I love music, and I thought this would be a fun way to practice. I began by choosing simple songs with clear lyrics, and at first, I didn't understand everything. I'd hear some words that I knew, but others were unclear. So, I looked up the lyrics online, printed them out, and followed along while listening to the songs. It was amazing how quickly I started to connect the words to their meanings. For example, when I listened to the song "Hello" by Adele, I looked at the lyrics and realized how much I could understand just by paying attention to the words. The first time I tried this, it felt challenging. I'd listen to a song and understand only a few words here and there. But I didn't let that discourage me. I repeated the song over and over again. Each time I listened, I started catching more words. Slowly, I began to understand the meaning of the lyrics, even if I didn't know all of the vocabulary. This repetition helped me get used to how words sounded in real speech. It was one thing to learn words from a textbook, but it was completely different to hear them used naturally in a song. I began to notice the rhythm and the flow of English, and this helped me learn how to speak more naturally as well. As I kept listening to songs, I expanded to different genres. I listened to pop songs, slow ballads, and even songs in English that were a little faster. Some of the faster songs were hard to follow, but that's when I realized how important it was to push myself. The more challenging the song, the more I learned. Some songs had words that I had never heard before, and I would look them up in a dictionary. After a while, I began recognizing these new words in other contexts, and they became part of my vocabulary. After songs, I turned to videos. I started watching YouTube videos, especially ones that were designed for English learners. These videos were great because they used slow, clear speech, and they often included subtitles. Watching these videos with subtitles helped me a lot. I could see the words and hear them at the same time. This way, I not only heard the correct pronunciation, but also saw how the words were spelled and used in context. The visual connection was incredibly helpful for my understanding. I would watch videos about topics I enjoyed, like travel, cooking, or even English lessons. Watching content that interested me kept me motivated. I remember watching a lot of cooking videos because I love food. In these videos, the speakers would explain recipes in simple English, and I would try to follow along. Even though I didn't understand everything, I would learn new words related to food, cooking, and ingredients. For example, I learned how to say chop, sauté, boil, and stir-fry. After hearing those words several times, I started using them in my own conversations, even if I was just talking to my family about food. As I became more comfortable with listening, I started watching English movies and TV shows. At first, it was difficult. The characters spoke so quickly, and I could barely understand what they were saying. But I didn't give up. I started watching the movies with subtitles in English. This was extremely helpful because I could match the spoken words to the text on the screen. Slowly, I began to understand the conversations. At first, I would pause the movie and rewind it to catch parts I didn't understand, but over time, I didn't need to do that as often. There was one show in particular that helped me a lot: Friends. It's a popular TV show, and it's known for having easy-to-understand dialogue. The characters speak clearly and use everyday language. I would watch one episode, and after finishing, I would go back and listen to certain parts again. By the end of the episode, I knew the meaning of so many phrases and words that I had never heard before. Watching Friends also taught me the rhythm of natural English conversations, how people laugh, pause, or express themselves during chats. These little things made a big difference in my speaking and listening. As I watched more and more English content, I started picking up on common expressions, idioms, and slang. Words like, "What's up?" or "I'm just kidding," became easier to understand because I kept hearing them in different contexts. Even though I didn't always understand every single word, I was starting to get the gist of the conversations. I learned that listening is not just about understanding every word, but about understanding the meaning of the conversation as a whole. This was a huge breakthrough for me. In addition to watching videos and listening to songs, I also started listening to English podcasts. Podcasts are great because they cover a variety of topics, from science to self-improvement to current events. They allowed me to hear different accents and voices, and they helped me get used to hearing English in different contexts. Sometimes, I would listen to podcasts during my commute or while doing chores around the house. Even though I didn't understand everything, I still learned new words and phrases just by listening regularly. Over time, I realized that my listening skills had improved dramatically. Listening to English every day also helped me with my pronunciation. The more I listened to native speakers, the more I started to mimic their speech patterns. I paid attention to how they pronounced certain words, the intonation they used, and the rhythm of their speech. This helped me improve my own pronunciation. For example, I used to struggle with the difference between the theet sound in think and this. But by listening to it over and over, I learned how to pronounce it correctly. Listening to songs and videos taught me these small nuances that made my speech sound more natural. Over time, listening to English every day became a habit. I didn't have to force myself to do it anymore. It was just part of my routine. Whether I was listening to music, watching a video, or following a podcast, I knew that each moment spent listening was helping me improve. And the best part was that it didn't feel like studying. It was fun. I was learning new words and phrases, and it didn't feel like hard work. Listening to English became something I enjoyed, and that made all the difference. So, if you're just starting out, I encourage you to listen to English every day. Don't worry if you don't understand everything right away. The more you listen, the more familiar the language will become. You'll start recognizing words, then phrases, and eventually entire conversations. It's all about exposure, and with consistent practice, your listening skills will improve significantly. After spending some time listening to English and learning new vocabulary, I realized that the next big step in my journey was to practice speaking. For a long time, I was afraid of making mistakes. I thought that I had to speak perfectly before I could start using English in conversations. But soon, I learned that speaking, no matter how imperfectly, was one of the most important parts of learning the language. At first, I only spoke English in my head. I would practice sentences silently, imagining conversations, but I didn't actually speak out loud. I was afraid of making mistakes or sounding funny, but I soon realized that speaking was essential if I wanted to build confidence and actually be able to use English in real situations. The first step I took was to speak with my friends. I started with people I felt comfortable with, those who were supportive and patient with me. At first, I only spoke a few sentences at a time. Sometimes I'd say, "Hello, how are you?" or "What are you doing today?" These simple questions were great practice. Even though I only knew a small amount of English at the time, speaking helped me put the words I had learned into action. Every time I used English, even for something as small as saying thank you, I felt a little bit more confident. I was able to make small sentences, and that felt like a huge achievement. At first, my friends didn't speak much English, but they encouraged me to continue practicing with them. Whenever I made a mistake, they didn't judge me. Instead, they would repeat what I said correctly, and that helped me learn. They would smile and tell me, "It's okay, you're doing great." That kind of encouragement was crucial for my progress. If I had let the fear of making mistakes stop me, I would never have spoken in English at all. To keep practicing, I started using language apps. There are many apps designed for language learners, and I found them to be really helpful. One of the best features of these apps was that I could practice speaking in a structured way. The apps would give me phrases and sentences to repeat after the voice prompts, and I would try to mimic the pronunciation and rhythm. It was really helpful for learning common phrases that are used in everyday conversations like, "What time is it?" or "Where are you from?" The most interesting part of the apps was the speech recognition feature. The app would listen to me speak and compare it to the correct pronunciation. If my pronunciation wasn't perfect, it would let me know and ask me to try again. At first, it was frustrating because my pronunciation wasn't always correct, but with time, I began to get better at speaking clearly. Every time I got a sentence right, it felt like a small victory. This encouraged me to keep going, even if I felt nervous about speaking. After using language apps for a while, I wanted more opportunities to speak with real people, so I looked for language exchange partners. These are people who are learning your language and want to practice speaking with you in return. There are many websites and apps where you can find language partners. I found a few people who were learning my native language and who were willing to practice English with me. At first, I was very nervous, but I knew that speaking with real people would help me get used to having real conversations. The first conversation I had with my language partner was a bit awkward. We both struggled to find the right words, and sometimes we just stared at each other, unsure of what to say next. But as we kept talking, it became easier. We would speak for just a few minutes at first, but each time we were able to have longer and longer conversations. Even though we both made mistakes, we understood each other, and that was the most important part. Sometimes, when I didn't know a word, my language partner would help me by explaining it in simple English. They would use other words to describe the word I didn't understand, and that taught me new vocabulary. On the other hand, when my partner didn't know a word, I would do the same for them. This made me realize how valuable it is to have someone to practice with. We both made progress because we were patient with each other and allowed ourselves to make mistakes. Speaking with my language partners also gave me the confidence to speak English outside of these practice sessions. I began using English when I went out to restaurants or when I met new people. I started small, ordering food in English, asking for directions, and talking to waiters or cashiers. Even though I was nervous, I pushed myself to speak. Sometimes I would get confused or forget words, but the more I spoke, the more comfortable I became. I started to feel less afraid of making mistakes because I realized that everyone makes mistakes when learning something new. The important thing is to keep going. Another thing that helped me build my speaking confidence was repeating phrases I heard in movies or TV shows. I would watch a short scene, pause it, and then try to repeat what the characters had said. This helped me improve my pronunciation and gave me a chance to practice the natural rhythm of speech. Over time, I began to sound more like a native speaker. This also helped me build my vocabulary and learn new expressions. For example, I learned common phrases like, "What do you mean?" or "Can you repeat that?" which helped me in real conversations when I didn't understand something. One day, I had a conversation with a stranger in English. I was waiting in line at a coffee shop, and the person in front of me turned around and asked, "Is this seat taken?" At first, I was a little surprised because I wasn't expecting to speak in English, but I quickly answered, "No, it's free." That simple exchange made me realize how far I had come. I was able to have a real conversation without feeling nervous, and that gave me so much confidence. There were times when I still felt unsure of myself, but I kept reminding myself that every time I spoke, I was getting better. Speaking wasn't just about getting the words right. It was about building confidence and getting used to using English in real situations. Mistakes were part of the learning process, and they helped me improve. As I practiced speaking more and more, I began to enjoy it. Speaking English didn't feel like a task anymore. It felt like a way to connect with others and share ideas. Looking back, I can see how much speaking helped me improve my overall fluency. It wasn't just about learning new vocabulary or grammar rules. It was about practicing what I had learned, using it in conversations, and building the confidence to communicate with others. If you're just starting out, I encourage you to speak as much as possible. Don't be afraid to make mistakes. The more you practice, the easier it will get. Speaking is an essential part of learning English, and it's the best way to truly feel like you are becoming fluent. After spending time focusing on vocabulary and getting more comfortable with listening and speaking, I realized that I needed to learn some basic grammar. I had heard a lot of people say that grammar was difficult, and for a while I was nervous about it. I thought that in order to speak well, I needed to understand every complicated rule, like verb tenses, conditionals, or the subjunctive mood. But when I started learning grammar, I realized that it didn't have to be as hard as I had imagined. In fact, I found that learning simple grammar rules made a huge difference in how well I could speak and understand English. I started by focusing on the most basic grammar rules. The first rule I learned was how to use the verb to be in simple sentences. For example, I am, she is, he is, we are, and they are. These phrases might seem easy, but they are the building blocks of English. I began by making simple sentences like, I am happy, she is a teacher, and we are friends. At first, I didn't worry too much about making them perfect. I just wanted to use these sentences in everyday conversations. Every time I said I am or he is, I felt more confident in using English to express myself. It was important for me to learn how to form positive, negative, and question sentences with these basic structures. For example, I learned how to say, I am not tired, and are you a student? These are simple sentences, but they helped me understand how the language works. I didn't focus on long or complicated sentences at first because I knew that I needed to get comfortable with the basics before moving on to more difficult things. By focusing on I am, she is, and they are, I could communicate basic ideas without feeling overwhelmed. In addition to the verb to be, I also learned how to form simple sentences with other verbs. For example, I eat, she works, they study. This step was very important because I could use these simple structures to describe daily activities. When I was just starting out, I would say things like, I eat breakfast, she works at a hospital, or they study English. These simple sentences helped me feel more confident because I was able to express myself in English, even if it was just about my daily routine. Another grammar rule that I focused on was the use of articles. In English, we have a, an, and the, and it was important for me to understand when and how to use them. At first, I focused on when to use a and an before a noun, like a book or an apple. These were small details, but they made my sentences sound more natural. The article the was a little trickier, but I started to use it when I was talking about something specific like the school or the car. Even though I didn't always get it right, I practiced these articles as much as I could, and over time I became more comfortable using them. I also learned how to use there is and there are. These phrases are very useful when talking about things that exist. For example, there is a cat on the table, or there are two books on the shelf. I found that using there is and there are helped me give simple descriptions of things around me. It was a great way to practice grammar while also learning to talk about my surroundings. I started saying things like, there is a dog in the park, or there are many people in the room. The next step in my grammar journey was learning how to form questions. In English, we use auxiliary verbs to make questions, such as do, does, is, are, and can. I didn't focus on complex question structures at first. Instead, I began with simple questions like, do you like coffee? Or, is she your friend? By practicing these questions, I could start conversations and interact with people in English. I realized that knowing how to ask questions was just as important as knowing how to make statements. As I continued learning, I didn't rush into complicated tenses like past, present perfect, or future continuous. Instead, I focused on the present simple tense, which I found the easiest to learn. I learned how to make positive and negative sentences in the present tense, such as, I like pizza, and she doesn't like coffee. The more I practiced these simple sentences, the easier it became to understand other people and speak with them. By starting with simple grammar rules, I didn't feel overwhelmed, and I could already communicate basic ideas. As I continued to practice, I also started to pay attention to word order in sentences. In English, the word order is usually subject, verb, object. For example, I, subject, eat, verb, pizza, object. I practiced making different sentences with this structure like she, subject, reads, verb, books, object, or they, subject, play, verb, football, object. This helped me understand how sentences in English are organized. Once I understood this basic word order, I could start forming sentences with more complex ideas. Along with these simple rules, I made sure to read and listen to examples of grammar in use. I watched YouTube videos and listened to podcasts where the speakers used simple grammar. I would listen carefully to how they used basic structures like I am or he likes, and I would repeat those sentences out loud to practice. I also read books that used easy English, such as children's stories, and I paid attention to how the grammar worked in these books. I didn't try to understand every little detail of the grammar, but I did my best to pick up patterns and phrases that I could use in my own conversations. Another important part of learning grammar was practicing with language apps. Many apps have exercises that focus on specific grammar rules. I would complete these exercises every day, making sure I understood the correct way to form sentences. Some of the exercises helped me practice the verb to be in different tenses, like she is and they were. This was a great way to solidify what I had learned and ensure I was using the grammar correctly. While grammar can feel overwhelming at times, I realized that it wasn't as difficult as I thought. By focusing on simple grammar rules, I was able to build a strong foundation in English. I didn't try to learn everything all at once. Instead, I took it step by step, starting with the basics and building on them over time. The key was to keep practicing regularly and to be patient with myself. I knew that as I continued learning, I would get better and better, and that feeling of progress kept me motivated. So, if you're just starting to learn English, I encourage you to focus on the basics first. Don't worry about memorizing every grammar rule. Start with simple sentences and basic structures and build from there. With consistent practice, you'll find that grammar isn't as difficult as it seems. It's all about learning the building blocks and using them in your everyday conversations.